Thank you all for coming out today. My name is Tom, and it is my honor to introduce the first of our speakers for this afternoon's session, Dr. Ted Hiebert, who's a Canadian visual artist and theorist. And his artworks have been shown across Canada and the Pacific Northwest and in group exhibitions internationally. Recent work has been shown at Place in Portland, Oregon, Sam Gallery in Seattle, Kirkland Arts Center in, you heard it here first, Kirkland, Washington, and the Xi'an Academy of Fine Art in Xi'an in China. Dr. Hiebert is a founding member of the Noxious Sector Arts Collective, with whom he has recently exhibited and performed at Open Space in Victoria, Paved Arts in Saskatoon, Eastern Bloc in Montreal, and the Goodman Arts Center in Singapore. He is the author of the book In Praise of Nonsense, Aesthetics, Uncertainty, and Postmodern Identity, which was published last year by McGill Queen's University Press, and is a member of the editorial board of the Great Sea Theory online journal, and is an assistant professor of interdisciplinary arts at the University of Washington in Bothell. And today he will be speaking on embodiment technology in the space between magnets, which, if you saw his performance on Friday night, you will know that he has a strong sort of head for magnets. So I'm just terribly sorry. Please join me in welcoming Ted Hiebert.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks to Malenti and Jen for inviting me to be part of this great this great weekend of series of events. I'm going to sort of test out a new style of doing these kind of artist talks today. One that for myself just kind of comes out of trying to interface the work that I do with the topics of the conference, so these great ideas of toxicity, but also bioarts and biotechnology in that broader sense. I've never really self-identified as a bioartist, so a really interesting creative challenge to come and be a part of the conversations here, and to really try and think through some of the ways in which the work and the thinking that I do can maybe extend into some of the territory that you all negotiate so expertly. I'm going to work during the course of this short talk on a kind of extended metaphor. And it's the metaphor really of the space between magnets. That sort of strange space where you've got opposites that attract or repel, right? That you've got these sort of polarized objects that create a certain type of affected, forceful space. I'm always really struck by the things, not the things that are there, not the things that we can analyze, not the things that we can sort of provide data for, but exactly the opposite. The things that we can't see, the things that maybe even don't exist. And for me, the space between magnets is kind of one of those things. You hold two magnets up. When you put them in, within a certain proximity to one another, something changes. The space in between them, well, we can look right through it. We can put our hand right through it. We don't necessarily feel anything. And yet, depending on which way those magnets are oriented, everything about that space changes, right? And so I don't pretend to have any answers about what that means, just to say that my starting point is a moment of curiosity, trying to, in some way, access, without explaining, that kind of strange space between magnets. Now, I also want to, at the same time, kind of give a little bit of a history of the project that I have in the Toxicity exhibition, a series of kind of magnet tiaras that I've been doing recently, and to try and backtrack that, because it really comes out, it's like an extension, I suppose, of work that I've been doing over the last several years with Noxious Sector Arts Collective. So these are two friends in Victoria, BC that I collaborate with quite frequently. Doug Jarvis, who's the programming director at Open Space Artist Run Center, and Jackson Two Bears, who's the Audain Fellow of Indigenous Art at the University of Victoria. For us, we formed this collective back in 2005 as a way of trying to give some conceptual and creative momentum to projects that, in some cases are just really, really dumb. In other cases, they're just not very serious. They're sort of playful. They're looking at things that, the world of science might treat as fictions at best, or as pseudoscience and deception at worst. We frame what we do quite strategically as a formalized exploration of informal spaces, right? So we're really interested in the informal, but we understand that part of what we have to do as artists is frame that informality somehow. And so there's always a tension there in the work that we do. A tension, that I guess in many ways I would want to talk about first and foremost as a performative tension. It's a tension that starts to happen when how we live and what we do and what we think and understand, don't jive, right? When there's a difference between the two, right? When either they attract or repel, right? Attractions, things that are like deeply illogical, persuasive culture, propagandistic cultures, right? Cultures of fear, we heard talked about today, cultures of anger, we've heard, just these really, really powerful driving forces of the world that we live in that are definitely not sensical or rational forces, right? And on the other hand, those things that really push us away, that alienate us, those things that either, for bodies, there's no way to experience, or for minds, there's no way to access. So just by way of a kind of introduction, I guess, I'll show you a couple of the projects that we've been working on recently to give you a sense of what I mean by this formalized forum for informal inquiry that we call Nauseous Sector. This is the first project that we've been doing for the last 5 years, and we called it the World Telekinesis Competition. And what we did is we just took this speculative phenomena, right? The idea of telekinesis, of moving mind or moving matter with the power of the mind alone. And we thought, well, this is very new agey, right? It's very pseudoscience, it's paranormal territory. There's no real hard data on whether any of this exists or not, but we didn't really care about that. Instead, we sort of thought, what an absolutely brilliant metaphor for what, science and art alike aspire to do, to make a material difference with the power of our minds alone. Now, we weren't really interested in proving or disproving anything. So instead, we created a competitive context. You see one of the tournament boards up on the screen behind the camera. And we invited teams from around the world to kind of sign in, to play along, right? We did the experiment first ourselves, sat around the three of us at a table competing against three friends in London, England. So really across the sea, this mental competition to influence the way a candle melts, right? So we designed this special game board. At the appointed time, we lit a candle. The candle would burn for 1 hour or until the flame went out. At the end of the hour, the team who had moved the most wax onto the opponent's side of the board won, right? So it was really deeply speculative, right? The way the tournament board sort of was set up, the winning team would advance, the losing team would be eliminated. Right, at the end of the competition, there was a trophy. So for 5 years we did this, and it's sort of like this really wonderful, whimsical experimental project, situated right beyond proof or truth, right? Situated in a place really where, well, what do you expect is going to happen? If you light a candle and you let it burn for an hour, well, the wax is going to drip, isn't it? Well, who's to say whether that dripping then is influenced by the teams or not? It might be, but we didn't really care to prove or not. What we cared about was providing the context in which people could actually have that experience, as speculative as it may be. So that's one instance. We've also done a series of projects recently where we're curious about the idea of haunting. And we mean that in really the most general, abstract way possible. What could be called a haunting, right? Lots of things can be called haunting, turns out, if you really think about it. But we wondered, the project started kind of saying, well, what is it that happens if you walk into a haunted room? We say ghosts haunt spaces. Does that mean like if a ghost is a person who's died and they continue to linger, does that person who has died gain some power that allows them to linger? Or did they already have it and they just didn't know it? In other words, can we haunt places if we set our minds to it? And what would that mean? And at the same time, isn't in some ways every place haunted by its own history? Aren't we? Isn't identity in its own sort of Derridian sense a haunting, right? As we carry with us all of the baggage that we've accumulated that makes us who we are. And yet, technological culture, lots of fear about haunting by this, by surveillance culture, by the government. All the reports right now, email traffic, cell phone traffic being monitored, being watched. In some ways, these devices that we carry with us are haunted devices too. So we thought, well, let's play this out, right? Let's just do some actions and see what we can come up with. So we planted some flags, haunting spaces. Turns out these little flags become great sort of takeaway objects. And within a couple of days, people were haunting each other, taking the flags and passing them on. It's like a curious little intervention that, grew legs of its own. We've also haunted people, sort of providing really political, speculative contexts in which we invited a whole bunch of people to haunt Stephen Harper on his birthday. Right? It was sort of like the perfect occasion. But it's also for us always to implicate ourselves in what we do. And so at the same time, we've haunted each other, right? Three buddies who know each other pretty well. Well, you can sort of think of what kind of trouble we could get up to poking at each other in interesting ways, right? So again, it's not really a project that makes any kind of definitive declaration or point. It just opens up a space, right? If you were to approach or engage the concept of haunting in some way, how would you do it, right? And what would it look like to formalize the informality of that? Our most recent one is a little bit, it's pushing a little bit forward. It's trying to materialize the imagination in some ways. We've been doing these meditation, technologically sort of augmented installations. This was from a performance in Montreal where we did it live. We've also done sort of more traditional gallery exhibitions where we've been using trance induction technologies. So flashing lights, which it turns out if you flash lights at a certain frequency, you can put people into a particular type of state of mind, sometimes a little bit more open to suggestion than they would otherwise be. The same is true for certain types of soundscapes, right? The sort of soothing sounds of different types of music, so the deep bass, right, of trance and house kinds of music, but also binaural beats. These sort of strange types of sounds where if you feed different frequencies of sound into each ear, you can actually end up with the perception of a sound that humans shouldn't be able to hear, right? But it's also a sort of deeply soothing sound that makes you kind of more open to suggestion than normal. And to accompany these, what we've been doing is we've been creating self-hypnosis tapes or guided visualizations, depending on how you want to talk about them, in which participants can lie down, on the yoga mats, or in more recent work, in a sort of induction chamber of one sort or another, put on the gear and be led through a guided meditation in which they experience common nightmares. So the most recent one is one in which participants have their teeth fall out, right? So you sort of go into these environments. And it's really to kind of charge that space, because we're so quick to dismiss the imagination in this scientific culture that we live in. We're so quick to dismiss fiction. We're so quick to dismiss things that can't be proven or aren't really there. In other words, that sort of, the problem of the imaginary in some ways, right? The problem of things that don't have evidence. Things like dreams, things like fantasies. Turns out things like nightmares are things that we all have more or less in common. This dream of having one's teeth fall out, the data is something like 7 out of 10 people have had a dream sort of similar to that. So despite how subjective and personal and fictitious such an experience sort of may seem, it's actually not, right? It's something that we share in common. We just don't necessarily share it in a communal way, right? So we've been really interested in that idea of kind of implanted thoughts as a form of art making. So with all of this, with all of this type of work, there are two things really that matter. The first is finding something that's like pretty far out and speculative that we're curious about, right? Something that actually could sustain an artistic exploration of one sort or another. The other thing that's important is finding a way to implicate ourselves in it. Finding a way, to not necessarily just be telling other people what we're doing or providing an experience only for other people, but to somehow, embody the speculations ourselves, in some ways. And so this magnet work, this is the sort of very first instance of the work that's up in the show. And this came out of Doug Jackson and I sitting around one day and listening to the news of one sort or reading the paper or something. But what came up was this story that one of us had heard of a neuropsychologist named Michael Persinger, who had been working out of Laurentian University, I think. What he'd been doing, though, is he'd been electromagnetically stimulating the temporal lobes of people. And what he found is that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when you electromagnetically stimulate the temporal lobes, you can induce a kind of transcendental vision in people, a sort of godlike experience, sort of, deeply spiritual kind of moment. Persinger, of course, instantly kind of formalized the experiment and began marketing what he called a God helmet, right, where you could sort of ostensibly plug it in and have your own personal encounter with God. We thought this was just like a brilliant, funny story, right? Like, what better way to access a kind of spiritual culture than plug-in, right? Isn't that the sort of dream of technology? Isn't that kind of all of the hype, right? Technology is going to help us to transcend. It's not a human project anymore. It's somehow a technologically mediated project. We wanted to play with it. We didn't quite know what to do, so we bought a bunch of magnets and we sewed them into some hats. And we put the hats on thinking, well, Persinger used electromagnets. Those are really, really high-powered magnets, and he used them for a very short duration of time. We weren't really interested in plugging ourselves in. So we decided to use weaker magnets, but extend the duration, right? So, in order to extend the duration for this was a performance that went on for about 3 hours, right? We wandered around different cities, in this case, Victoria, attaching our heads to different things. It seems sort of silly, but it would have sort of seemed sillier to sit across from each other for 3 hours saying, do you feel anything yet? No, not yet. Do you feel anything yet? No, not yet. So much better to kind of wander around the city. At the same time, I do have to say, wandering around the city, thinking about what you could attach your head to, was a totally different relationship to the city that I'd ever had before, right? Turns out, if you want to construct different ways of engaging in space, all you need is like a dumb catalyst, right? Something really, really simple can cause you to completely see the city that you otherwise live in a completely different light. So for us, that was a sort of transformative, interesting observation to make. The idea of somehow bringing together, again, right, this sort of speculation with the kind of embodied proximity, right? What the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk calls a critical proximity, right? For Sloterdijk, he's really sort of fed up with the cynical nature of ideology in our times. He said, well, we always sort of pretend that in order to really have a knowledgeable or informed answer, what we need to do is step away from the question. We need to step back so we can see things, objectively. Sloterdijk says, I think that's the wrong tactic. I think we're better stepping into it, stepping closer, trying to develop a critical proximity that results really from the vertigo of engagement, right? Not from the indifference of intellectual understanding. And whether or not he's absolutely right or debatably right or simply persuasive, sort of, for myself, a bit beside the point, because I find his perspective on it deeply seductive and in lots of ways really refreshing as well. It reminds me of, I'm a photographer by training, and so I teach Roland Barthes' beautiful book, Camera Lucida, in my classes all the time. But it reminds me of that book because there's something in that text of Barthes that I think really becomes, at least from my own perspective, a fundamental rule of understanding technology. Barthes sort of, in opposition to many other theorists of photography who say, photography really is the realization of the project of representation, the project of knowledge and information and charting and evidence. Barthes says, I don't think so. For Barthes, he really wants to draw the relationship between photography and, I would say, technology by extension, and theater. For Barthes, photography is first and foremost a performative endeavor. It's always about the moment that's been lost. It's always about a sort of, a death mask in some ways. Barthes goes right back to the Greeks and says, the idea of theater was really grounded in an attempt to access what couldn't be known, an attempt to access these sort of deep questions like the question of death, which we can't know anything about, but we can imitate, we can perform, we can theatricalize, we can dramatize. And in doing that, we can take ourselves one step closer, right, to developing a relationship with this question that we can't understand. And so for Barthes, the photograph isn't an information document at all. It's a deeply nostalgic document that's really about these kinds of dramatic fictions that if we look at them just right, we can sort of bring back to life. And I just really, really love that version of technology, right? I really love that way of thinking technology because it allows for, a sort of embodied space that's very quickly disposed of in an information culture. So for us, wandering around the city with magnets on our head, and I said this to a few people at the opening on Friday as well. People say, well, did you feel anything? You had these magnets on your head for a few hours wandering around the city. And the answer is always the same. Yeah, you feel some stuff, but is it the magnets or is it that you've made yourself into a public spectacle for 3 hours, right? Like which of those two things is responsible for the weird feelings that you have at the end of it? Or does it matter, right? Again, that sort of undecidable space that's becoming, for me at least, increasingly important to the nauseous sector collaborations, trying to find a way to create relationships with things that don't exist in a state that can be verified, in any sort of evidential way. So we've done this performance a few times. First we did it in Victoria, then in Calgary. This is the sort of lovely street mall in Calgary. Images were shown at Truck. And then we were invited to do a piece for the Xi'an Academy of Art in China. And so we sort of we weren't thinking too much about what we were doing. We just wanted a placeholder. We wanted a video. We wanted something durational. So we spent an hour kind of wandering around a gated house, attaching our head to the magnet, or our magnets to the fence as we went along, each carrying a camera while we were doing it. And it was just like sort of like the dumbest version of the video that we could come up with. But the whole point was to try and normalize the absurdity a little bit, because what we really had on our mind was the idea of taking this provocation of engaging in informal activities and turning it into an installation where, you know, our video is sort of there as, in a sense, a didactic panel for people. On the left are a series of scarves and hats with magnets sewn into them. And, you know, and we arranged to have a series of Chinese manhole covers brought into the gallery so that people had something to attach their heads to during the performance. So we thought, you know, in order to extend this, you know, the next step really is to turn it into an invitation, right? It's one thing for us to kind of make fools of ourselves and wander around attaching our heads to things. And it's another thing to say, you know, we actually think this isn't just a dumb artistic thing. This is a philosophical gesture. We invite you to try it, right? And it turns out the people in China were really, really into it. This was the president of the art school who at the opening decided that he was going to see what it was all about, right? And you could see again, the crowd forms around him. Afterwards, did you feel anything? Yeah, I felt like I was maybe the butt of a joke or maybe sort of engaged in something that I didn't know what was going to happen, right? Sort of an interesting kind of space. These spaces can be theorized though, right? I think most articulate theorization that I've had or that I've encountered comes from a thinker that I don't really like, but who I do teach because I think he's articulate on certain key points, and that's Nicolas Bourriaud, who's most famous for his theory of relational aesthetics, which kind of like popularized some social art movements in the 90s. But, you know, for me, what's interesting about Bourriaud are just those key moments when he tries really hard to put his thumb on like the pulse of contemporary art. Bourriaud says this, he says, "Contemporary art is like an orange rabbit sitting on my shoulder. You might not see the rabbit, but if you refuse to have a conversation about it, whether it's there or not, art fails. You walk away, there's not been an encounter. You have a choice though. You can play along. You can pretend to see the rabbit, or you can ask questions about the rabbit you don't see. We can have a conversation about something that isn't there. That's allowed. Conversation can do that, even if science can't, right? And for Bourriaud, that's the heartbeat that's the heart of contemporary art. Not whether the rabbit's there, but our ability to engage with those kinds of ideas, whether they're there or not. For Bourriaud, the only way art fails is if we don't make a social effort. Sort of like a strange twist on the question of contemporary art. You know, at its sort of most extreme, I suppose, one could propose art, contemporary art, as a sort of hallucinatory experience, right? At its extreme, at its most ephemeral. It doesn't matter if it's there or not. Thought object, random idea, speck of dust, right? Whatever it is, all that we need to do is somehow engage speculatively and creatively in the possibilities for that moment. With that said, it's not all hallucination, right? And some of the things that keep coming up with this work with magnets really are, well, what's the research say? What's the science? What are people doing, right? Because there is data here. Magnets are used. They have a place in the culture in which we live, right? So do a little bit of work and find out sort of some of what's gone on, you know, enough to sort of give, I don't know, some grounds, I suppose, to the question of whether or not we're messing up our minds by putting magnets on them, right? And some question, you know, some data, I suppose, that could give us access points to what happens in that space between magnets, whichever way they're aligned, right? So a couple of studies, researchers at the University of Auckland attached little magnets to the beaks of pigeons, homing pigeons. The poor little pigeons couldn't find their way home. Like a sort of strange intervention here, where all of a sudden a bird's ability to sort of orient itself directionally is impeded by the presence of magnets. Now, there are reasons for that, because I think pigeons use magnets in order to orient. So you put a magnet on, it counteracts the magnets that are already there. Researchers at MIT have found that certain types of magnetic pulses directed at certain parts of the brain can change people's ethical thresholds, right? Nothing super dramatic, but on those kinds of gray ethical areas, you know, would you steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving child, right? They found that before and after, you know, after the magnetic sort of stimulation, people were a little bit more likely to feel okay about it, right? The gray area gets a little lighter. And several studies, safety studies mostly, about the effects of MRI machines, right? And often finding that MRIs do produce vertigo, like real sort of registrable vertigo in the minds of people. It tends to fade, right? So nobody's super worried about it. But there is that that effect, that residual lingering of the magnets themselves. So I started looking into the magnets that we use. This is right off the website of KJ Magnetics, where I've ordered all of mine. It turns out that most of the magnets that we use, these sort of rare earth neodymium magnets, on their surface, they're about the same strength as a really weak MRI. But the way in which magnetic fields work is they fade really quickly. So by the time you get an inch away from the magnets themselves, the field is actually quite weak. So when they're right up against your head, so you're creating a field on the inside a little bit. But nothing in any order of an MRI machine. So because that's always a question that comes up, I thought, well, that's one I should address a little bit too. But because we started asking these questions about the actual data, the actual science, the actual effects, we also invested in some EEG equipment. Thinking, well, people keep asking, let's do some speculative work on the on the intersection between magnets and brains. And so each of us kind of came up with our own response to, well, that area of overlap. This is the work that Doug Jarvis did. This was around the time of all of the tsunamis overseas, and so Doug was watching disaster videos on YouTube with and without magnets. Some of them were in simulation form, some of them were in real form. And he was really just interested, mostly I think, in his affective response. Can I mark an affective response to disaster videos using an EEG machine, right? That was his speculation. 3 different disasters. One of them was from a Hollywood film, one of them was from YouTube, and I think one was news footage or something like this, right? Trying to see comparatively how his own physiology was responding. Jackson Two Bears decided he was going to try and really materialize the imagination. He created a software patch that would translate his brain waves into sounds on a keyboard, and he attempted to think into existence the Moonlight Sonata. It wasn't terribly effective, but it was quite lovely for its chaos. And I took the opportunity to begin what's become sort of the groundwork for the project that I'm showing here, which is a simple speculation of how many magnets it would take to actually hold through a human head. Right, again, the space between magnets. It's not super strong, but if you get the strong magnets, the field extends. You take a couple of those rare earth magnets, and you can stick them easily through a hand. How many would it take to get through a human head? And so I just kind of did a series of experiments with video in this case, which is turned into the photographs, photographs themselves. In this case, it turns out that I didn't do it in this picture, but afterwards I found that 2 of these large puck-sized magnets on each side of your head will actually hold through. So it's a pretty strong field then that can start to be created just by stacking the magnets. Now in all of this, you can see that we're pretty irreverent, right? When it comes to how we're treating science, how we're treating data. That's sort of on purpose, right? Part of it is because we're not scientists, and we're not terribly concerned with the truth or reality of things. But part of it is also that we're all 3 of us trained as technological thinkers. And we've been deeply, deeply influenced, for myself for sure, and for the others, I think as well, by a lot of postmodern sort of theories of technology, right? In particular, thinkers like Jean Baudrillard, Paul Virilio, Arthur Croker, really thinkers who see defiance as fundamentally linked to knowledge, right? There's this real danger in a technological world of not realizing how enabled we're becoming, right? And somehow feeling that enabled that those enabled sensations and those enabled possibilities are coming from our own creative minds instead of from the sort of packages that we implement to our own identities. Again, because I think a lot about philosophy or about photography and philosophy, I go right to a really short but lovely book by Willem Flusser on the philosophy of photography, in which he says something that just really strikes me. He says, well, you can only take photographs of things that you can take photographs of. It's like this completely self-evident statement, right? But what he means by that is that the apparatus that takes pictures really controls what can be, what kinds of pictures you can take, right? The apparatus runs the risk of telling you what you can do with it, right? Well, this is sort of commonplace in the world of technological theory, going right back to Marshall McLuhan, right? Saying the medium is the message. But Flusser gives it a sort of contemporary stakes. He also gives a sort of proposed solution, which is the solution of defiance. So you have to find a way to be unfaithful to the apparatuses that you use. You know, whether those are machines or ideas. For myself, I think the argument holds equally well. Right? So how are we, you know, if we're genuinely interested in knowledge and science and information, how do we at the same time find a way to be unfaithful to those processes that we're engaging, right? In order to make sure that we are engaging them and not the other way around. You know, it's just like Bachelard's sort of notion of clever disobedience, right? Where Bachelard says knowledge can only come out of transgression. You don't just learn things. If you just learn things, you're just replicating what's already been there, right? Newness involves transgression, involves disobedience. It requires being unfaithful to the knowledge that existed before us. And so between magnets, right? A series of meditations really, simply on what it means to build an embodied relationship to technology. You know, the larger theoretical context, and where I would try to make a connection, I suppose, to, you know, this wonderful world of bioart that I'm seeing kind of unfold around me this weekend. You know, is really in terms of a new theory of technology put out just this year by the Canadian media thinker Arthur Croker. It's a book called Body Drifts. And in this book, Croker makes this tremendous claim that the body is the new language of technology. Technology, he says, wants to be embodied. It doesn't want this disembodied state that we've put it into. Technology wants a body. And because we've offered our bodies to it, it's more than happy to meet us halfway, right? And so in this is something like really, really beautiful. It's a sequel to like Jean Baudrillard's theory of the reversibility of representation, right? Where Baudrillard says, you know, you think that a picture represents you, but you're wrong. If you doubt me, try and cross the border without a passport. When you make that, you know, when you make that move, you go to the border with or without your passport, you know, you're being compared to your picture. But it's not you that's the authority, it's the picture. If you don't look enough like your picture, you're denied access, right? So it's not a representation of you, you're a representation of it, right? And for Baudrillard, that's how the reversibility of the language of technology begins to really wash us over in important and profound ways. You know, Croker takes this one step further, saying, well, you know, when representations aren't just visual, when representations, as we've seen with, you know, with the work in the toxicity show, when representations, grown artworks, grown things, take on lives of their own, the whole situation becomes super, super complex, right? And what's at stake in all of that, in a lot of ways, is really just the possibility of alternate logics. So Croker goes to, you know, the sort of really profound work of Donna Haraway, Catherine Hills, and Judith Butler, looking for a politics of the body that can help give new insight into the language of the body and the code of the body, right? And where he ends up with are in things that defy codes, things like genetic drift, things like mutation, the illogic of bodies as somehow significant when it comes to trying to understand the direction in which technology is taking us, right? So for Croker, the first thing we have to do is get over the idea that the world makes sense, the world of technology, the evolution of technology, right? All of this sort of, you know, wonderful enthusiasm about technological transcendence just waiting to happen as if we can only be innovative enough and make the new next hot discoveries. You know, not so much. It's like this evolution will be deeply irrational and it will implicate us not as sort of spirits and souls, but as bodies. You know, for me, it was a really kind of profound and new argument. And what I'm finding so lovely about this encounter is that for all of you, this seems to already be second nature, right? So it's really lovely for me to sort of be up here and be able to share, you know, a few of my own pictures, my own kinds of forays into, you know, these sort of, well, embodied versions of technology in some ways, right? To try and wear the force fields, you know, that are sort of unfolding all around us, not really knowing what I'm going to get, right? But really just kind of looking for those ways in which differences to the body can start to make also differences for the ways in which we think the question of technology. So these are just the images from the show. Malenti's famous magnetic baptism. All right, thank you.